Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brennan Center for Justice event at NYU School of Law. I'm John Cowell, the Vice President for Programs at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform, revitalize, and defend the systems of democracy and justice in the United States. There are 2.2 million Americans behind bars today. We have 5% of the world's population and a staggering 25% of the world's prisoners. More and more people agree that locking too many people up for too long is not the cure. But how do we cure America's epidemic of mass incarceration? This new volume, Decarcerating America, From Mass Punishment to Public Health, provides a whole menu of solutions. The book includes essays from leaders across the criminal justice reform movement. Their ideas range from improving prison conditions, to reforming parole, to creating effective youth reentry programs, to providing alternative treatments for mental health and addiction issues, to developing new industries to replace the prison economy. Decarcerating America was edited by NYU Professor of Global Health, Ernest Drucker, who's here in the audience, and it's being published by our friends at the New Press. We also have two of the book's contributors joining us today. To my left is Judith Greene. She is a leading criminal justice policy expert, an advocate working in the field for decades. As the founding director of Justice Strategies, Judith works to provide high-quality research to support grassroots movements and sensible policy reforms. She has served as a Soros Senior Justice Fellow. I used to work at Open Society, so hello for that. She was a RAND Corporation Research Associate, and she was Director of Court Programs at the Vera Institute for Justice. She's also a prolific writer on issues of criminal sentencing, police practices, and correctional policy. Robin Steinberg, in the middle, founded Bronx Defenders, which has fought for the rights of criminal defendants in the Bronx for 20 years. Her organization is widely known for its remarkable innovation. Among other things, they pioneered the holistic defense strategy now used across the country that brings together interdisciplinary teams of lawyers and social service providers to address the many needs that people in the criminal justice system have. Robin is the Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow at UCLA School of Law, and in 2017, she launched the Bail Project, an unprecedented national effort to combat pretrial incarceration. The initiative works in collaboration with public defender offices across the country in high-need jurisdictions to pay bail for low-income defendants. I also understand that she founded the Oklahoma group, Still She Rises. To moderate the discussion, I'm pleased to introduce Nicole Fortier. Until recently, Nicole worked with me at the Brennan Center for Justice as an attorney in our justice program. She recently joined the American Civil Liberties Union as Advocacy and Policy Counsel for the Campaign for Smart Justice. So with that, we'll start. I do want to let you know that the book, which is terrific, is for sale, and the editor is here, so we hope you will consider purchasing the book at the end of this event. Nicole?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I feel like we can do a little bit better. There are people watching online. They have to know there's a lot of people in this room. Help me out. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Much better, much better. I'm truly excited to be here today and to be talking to two of the most amazing women in this industry, honestly. And we really need to take a step back for one moment before we get to the book and think about the fact that 2.2 million people are behind bars. But that's actually something most of us already know. We really have come to already accept that mass incarceration exists, that it's harmful to our communities and to our country, and a lot of us in this country already agreed that we need to hit reverse. But that doesn't mean solutions are easy to identify or easy to achieve. This book, Decarcerating America, which you can buy after this and get signed, offers a set of solutions for us to consider. And so with that, I'd love to dig a little deeper into your chapters in particular. So New York City is seen today as a model for local criminal justice reform. But before that, it was no exception to the rise of mass incarceration. Judy, your chapter focuses on this New York story. Can you explain to us the key drivers that led mass incarceration into the city and how it hit its peaks in the 90s?
The growth of mass incarceration.
The growth of mass incarceration
for New York
in the
City
city
itself, or the whole
Yeah.
country? I mean, the story
For the
is
city itself.
very similar. Well, I came to New York City to work at the Bureau Institute of Justice in 1981, when there were 47,000 people in our city jail complex, which we call Rikers Island, although there are jails in different boroughs too. That was before New York City unleashed its war on drugs. And so actually, I take that back. That was 47,000 was post-war on drugs. Sorry about that. I thought the population was outrageous in 1981, and I watched it grow to 47,000 in 1991, a decade of unrelenting growth, and much of it having to do with the New York Police Department, which began on the Lower East Side in 1984 or 85, with, where they would cordon off streets and just sweep everybody into, what we might now call a kettle, and arrest everyone that they thought had anything to do with selling or using drugs. And that was, interestingly, right around the time that East Village was beginning to gentrify, maybe a pattern there. And on the heels of PMP, the police department developed something called TNT, which sounds even more explosive. And that was a roving band of narcotics cops. Undercover buy and bust was the specialty, but also the sweeps continued. And they would spend 3 months or so in a given neighborhood, often a neighborhood that was ripe for gentrification. And then they would move to another borough and so on and so forth. And that did have a lot to do with swelling the population to its high in 1991. Later on in the 90s, there were state sentencing reforms around truth in sentencing. Governor Pataki sponsored bills that abolished parole for people who are doing time for violent offenses or persistent violent offenders. And that had an impact on the city jail system because it put more people in pretrial facing yet a longer and definite prison sentence. And so that was a contributor. But nonetheless, the jail population began to decline in 91 slightly. But the largest amount of our jail decarceration began to take place in the year 2000. 1998, 1999, the police department started to slack off somewhat on its drug enforcement activities. And then 2000 was a sort of a watershed year. And I can talk about that now, or you can ask me later about what happened.
We can circle back to that. I think that the total numbers, and I think for Rikers Island in 91, there was 22,000 people there, and then in 1998, the peak of the prison, the prison population here from the city in the state's prisons was 47,000 people, and those numbers are really staggering, and they're very shocking, and it's easy to focus on that. But I think it's really important to remember that those numbers actually represent real people whose lives are forever altered by coming into contact with the system. And I know, Robin, you started your chapter by saying an arrest is never just an arrest. Could you unpack what that means?
Sure. I mean, first, I also just, in terms of the numbers, right? So, because I think it's important to put the context here, right? So 2.2 million is the number that everybody talks about in prisons. I think what's important for everybody to also recognize is that at the local level, we are churning 11 million people annually through our jails. So the prison population is one piece of this, but the who's coming into the local jails around this country, it's a much higher number than 2.2. It's 11 million people a year. That should shock everybody in this room. Still shocks me. Anyway, back to where I was when I think about this. What did you ask me?
Arrest is never just an arrest.
Yeah, so it's a little bit where you were going, right? So an arrest is never an arrest, and it's a phrase that I think we use because it was catchy, but what it really was designed to do was to let people understand that the criminal legal system ensnares somebody in its system. When I say somebody, low-income people, disproportionately low-income people of color across this country, and that there are a host of collateral consequences that flow from that arrest. And I have to be honest, I started my career as a public defender in 1982, and I was trained by some incredibly talented, dedicated, passionate lawyers at the Legal Aid Society, and everything about my training focused me on the criminal case. Like that was what I learned how to do, focus on the criminal case, understand what the evidence is, understand what's happening, and there was no conversation at all, and I literally was unaware of the fact that those criminal convictions, even for minor cases, what we would consider minor cases, that don't even involve jail time, where somebody comes in and pleads guilty to a marijuana case, they get time served, or a fine, or what we would consider sort of the minor, low-level offenses, nothing is minor, we're having these impacts in people's individual lives, in their families' lives, and in their communities' lives that spread out for months and oftentimes years and sometimes for a lifetime into other areas of people's and families' lives that destabilize them forever in different ways, right? So the way that you begin to think about it is, a misdemeanor drug conviction can result in losing your public housing. I never got trained as a public defender about that, right? We weren't thinking about that, right? So 6 months after you took that deal in criminal court that you thought was so good for your client, like, I got a really good deal, I worked this out, time served, all done, shake your client's hands on the steps of the courthouse. 6 months later, they get the eviction notice under their door. And their lives are falling apart. And we, as sort of the public defender arena at the front end of this, unintentionally, and don't get me wrong, I think public defenders, myself included, try really hard and work under difficult conditions to do the work we're doing, right? But we're actually putting our clients in harm's way, right? And so that's the unintended consequence of even the work we did as public defenders, right? We're not looking at housing, we weren't looking at employment, we weren't looking at licensing, we weren't looking at child welfare and the ways that impacts particularly primary caregivers and women in the system when there is a criminal conviction. And so that broadening that, so when I say an arrest is never an arrest, what I mean is it's just the very beginning of the sort of devastating wave of consequences that can happen to somebody, most of which were developed in our Get Tough on Crime years, where we simply weren't satisfied by just incarcerating people and destroying their families and undermining their communities. We had to attach other things, right? We had to sort of do more. Immigration consequences, another area that's beginning to be talked about wildly now and widely, which is another place where people took pleas on cases who are now being actually subject to deportation from those convictions, right? So an arrest is never an arrest. Yeah.
And how does the Bronx Defenders' holistic defense strategy and model redefine the role of a public defender to tackle these consequences?
So it's about recognizing that we have an obligation and a responsibility to our clients and to their families and the communities that we're serving to provide at minimum counsel in those other areas, optimally, if you're able to do it, to provide actual representation and defense in those other areas, right? So at the Bronx Defenders, over the years, now we didn't start this way, right? We started with a small group of lawyers and we focused on criminal cases, but over the years we began to sort of develop and a sort of much more interdisciplinary approach and created actual teams so that there are people who are advocates and experts in everything from how do you get your property back from the police department once they've taken it, to how do you prevent a deportation, to how do you represent a family in court who are at risk of losing their children in the child welfare system. What do you do about licensing, the different areas, and having the advocates and experts in those areas working together in an interdisciplinary way. The way we simplified that, and we stole this 100% from Atul Gawande, from the Checklist Manifesto, was the minute we began to realize all these consequences that are unique, some are unique to New York City and some are more national, is that we created a checklist. So that the very first interview with clients, right, we are doing a checklist right away in the areas of most impact and where the collateral consequences are most dire, so that we can then make sure that the advocates on the team, right, understand that those issues need to be talked about, there needs to be counseling about them, there needs to be representation in those different areas. And that will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and from state to state, right? So, what those teams look really different in North Tulsa, Oklahoma, where, Still She Rises operates as a holistic defender office. The advocates look very different than they might in New York City because the collateral consequences differ from place to place. And just also so you get some sense of the depth of it, the American Bar Association has basically, charted 45,000 kinds of collateral consequences that happen. There are entire websites dedicated to the sort of unique collateral consequences in each jurisdiction. So public defenders need to sort of take that on. And we were doing that before Padilla, right? So Padilla came out from the Supreme Court and basically addressed the issue of immigration, although the language in that case is much broader than immigration, but since Padilla was struggling through an immigration consequence, it basically said, lawyers, criminal defense lawyers have a responsibility and an obligation to advise their clients, at minimum, to do advice about the potential collateral consequences of a criminal conviction before their client takes a plea or goes to trial. I would argue that our responsibility goes far beyond that, and that it goes actually to providing that defense or connecting clients to people that can do that defense.
And around the time the Bronx Defenders was founded, New York City starts its vast descent in incarceration rates. What turned it around?
It wasn't just the issue of drugs and drug policing, but let me say, the godfather of decarceration in New York City, was a man named Eddie Ellis. Eddie had been a Black Panther. He spent almost 3 decades in upstate, having been probably a COINTELPRO target. He was released in 1994, but before that, he was at Green Haven, and as a prisoner at Green Haven, he set up a policy institute and got a lot of prisoners from around the state doing research, doing fundamental research. Eddie was the author of a paper that he produced while he was in prison, identifying that the large share of prisoners in our state prison system who had been sentenced by New York City judges, and the analysis targeted or spotlighted what they called the 7 communities that drive the state prison population. Of course, while they're doing that, they're driving the local jail population. After Eddie was released, he organized and became he worked at NDS for some time, with Kevin Prentice, actually, who was my co-founder for Justice Strategies. Eddie and Kevin developed the Prison Moratorium Project in New York. I remember going to Albany in 1997, I think, when the launch of Drop the Rock, focusing on the Rockefeller drug programs, to do a seminar for SUNY students the day before they were going to raise a demonstration to state capitol over the fact that the state was now spending more money on prisons than on education. PMP grew and did a lot of work to, the meme Drop the Rock started creeping out into conversations. They got the hip hop community interested. There was a rap CD about Drop the Rock. And within a couple of years, the Correctional Association picked up the campaign, and the campaign spread. The Drug Policy Alliance got very involved. In 1999, the Drug Policy Alliance sponsored a voter poll statewide in New York from Zogby, which is a fairly conservative polling company, and that revealed that the great majority of New York State voters in the city as well as upstate would rather vote for a state official who wanted to drop the rock than for someone who wanted to sustain. Now, Eddie had and I'm not sure whether he knew it, but he had an unlikely partner in spawning the big decline while the rest of the country is still building prisons, building jails, and so forth. Because in 2000, Rudy Giuliani appointed a new police commissioner. His name was Bernard Kerik. And in 2000, Bernard Kerik began the dismantling of the special narcotics task forces and TNT and so forth. There had been a deal since the 80s, the TNT period, offered to new recruits coming out of the academy, and that if they would volunteer to spend 3 dirty, crusty years on the street doing buy and bust, they could find themselves on a fast track to a gold badge, a detective, the kind of people in suits that you see on TV. And that deal doubled the size of the narcotic squad. In 2000, Kerik decided apparently to use that incentive for something else. I don't know what, I've never been able to interview him. And so by attrition, within the space of 5 years or so, the size of our narcotics squad was smaller than it had been at the beginning of the drug war. So between Eddie, and I think Eddie and his fellow advocates and activists have the lion's share. I suspect Kerik might not have done that but for that poll that Zogby did, and showed that the organizing, the civic engagement, the public education effort that was spawned between 1997 and 1999 had helped to greatly change people's attitudes and people's understanding of why for many years before then advocates and activists had been advocating to drop the rock.
Amazing. So public polling, it does a lot. And Robin, can holistic defense help us decarcerate? And if it can, how?
So, holistic defense is I think, I like to think of it a couple ways, right? It's at the front end, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you really think about is, what is the work that you're doing at the very front end before somebody actually is incarcerated? And so I always have thought public defenders generally, and holistic defenders particularly, have a big role to play in decarceration, in preventing incarceration before it actually happens. So certainly I think that's it. Obviously, if you allow the collateral consequences and the devastating sort of impacts of that to happen to people, they are forced into desperate situations that make them more likely, I think, to become re-involved in the system. So that's another way. The other thing about holistic defense is it's designed to also capture sort of the larger systemic issues that are sort of both driving people into the system, but also what's happening once they're in the system. And if you're really lucky, like we are, and have the resources, you can also create sort of an impact team that's looking at how do we attack these larger systemic issues, what do they look like, and some of those are big, sexy, big systemic issues that everybody likes to talk about, and some of them are things like, how do you get your property back from NYPD, right, which was incredibly complicated, and we eventually had to file a lawsuit because we couldn't get NYPD to just agree to a new system, right? And so it's understanding that holistic defense is designed to actually elevate the stories of clients and their communities and then respond, and that response is both at an individual level, but it's also at a larger systemic level, and that really is the hope, I think, about where holistic defense and public defenders generally can actually play a role in decarceration.
So opponents to criminal justice reform very often say that if we enact all of these reforms and we try to decarcerate, we'll see a rise in crime. New York actually has the opposite story. It's one of the safest places.
It's a national story.
It's a national story.
It's a very good story. I think it's the best kind of evidence-based reform, because for so many years, so many papers by the Get Tough crowd and some of their favorite economists kept saying that, you know, most of the decline in crime that began in this country in the early 90s was due to all of the prison building and the prison boom that we had suffered through in the 1980s. And now you don't hear much about those econometrics, because in state after state, last year, or in the last year that I can get data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where you can compare one state against another, 2016, 41 states of the 50 had a decline from whatever year was their high water mark to 2016. And overall, the decline in our state prison population has been 6%. Remarkably, during the Obama administration, under Attorney General Holder, the federal prison population, which had been the fastest growing system in the early aughts, began to decline, and they're down by 13% by the end of 2016. And I don't want to. I refuse to talk or think about where it's going to go now, or what the data will look like for 2017, 2018. But in virtually all of the states, and in fact in the states that have had the largest degree of decarceration percentage-wise, are also associated with larger declines in crime. So, you know, I mean, we could, I'd be careful about saying it, but use those data to publish the preposterous kinds of things that all those economists were producing, you know, in the late 80s. And it's a wonderful story.
And so what lessons should other cities and states glean from the New York City story that seems to be able to drop incarceration so much while dropping crime so much, and also home of some holistic defense?
Yeah.
Both of you.
Well, the pattern, looking at, I mean, I've been a participant observer in many of the states that have and have not over the course of research that I've done going back to my years at Vera and through, you know, almost 18 years now at Justice Strategies. And the pattern suggests that looking at maybe 4 different mechanisms that get used in some states, those being organizing. New York is a splendid example. And New York, by the way, is number 2. I mean, I brought a cheat sheet here, and I can talk a little about the array of states that are at both ends, the growth states and the big or significant decarceration states. New York is now down, or as of 2016, down by 30%. New Jersey leads the pack at 37% decline. California is up there, Connecticut is up there, and I can talk a little more about that, and the nature, the political and the regionality of all of this is really quite diverse. Within the number of states that have, you know, reduced their population by at least 10%, which I'd call maybe the salience trigger, include Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So it's not just blue states, and it's not just the Northeast or the far West. So there's organizing, there's litigation, there is public education, there is the kind of, I call it top-down reform, sort of the notion, the kind of thing that this Council of State Governments does, where they put together an elite group of policymakers at the state level, judges and governors and legislators, and they look at the data and then they come up with some ideas about how to control prison spending, is the way they formulate it. And then in some states it's ballot measures. But if you look at the spread of the states at the top of the pyramid, the states that have come in at least 20% decarceration, quite significant. The states with the biggest bite in their prison population, probably the most money saved, tend to have used the outside game strategies. California, for example, is a combination of litigation and organizing and ballot measures. The litigation really got it started when the Prada case was approved by the Supreme Court, and Governor Brown had to figure out how to bring his population down according to standards set by the judges in that case. And he defelonized. He made thousands of prisoners who had been in state prison on relatively low-level offenses. He made the counties responsible for them. The judges could send them to a jail sentence, but they couldn't send them to prison anymore. And most of those cases are now getting probation. New Jersey, which is at the leader of the pack, decarceration started there with litigation, and in this case it was litigation against a parole board that wasn't doing its job. They weren't even holding hearings for people who were parole eligible. And that happened, that litigation was in year 2000. I was involved in New Jersey through much of the 2000s, working with Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And we had targeted the state's drug-free school zone laws, which were laws that essentially carried a mandatory sentence if you were living in a city where there were enough schools, usually housing projects were included, or daycare centers, and so much of Newark was blanketed. So any drug transaction happening in Newark mandated going to prison. FAM worked very hard on that starting in 2001, 2002. A sentencing commission, which is that elite body, I think at FAM's urging and the urging of the families of people who were in prison on mandatory drug sentences, took up the issue and published a report saying, these have got to go. The State Attorney General's office, under a Supreme Court decision separate from parole, the Supreme Court told the State Attorney General's office that prosecutors in the state had to develop plea guidelines on these drug mandatory sentences. And so the plea guidelines then guided local prosecutors to open pleas, so judges could avoid the mandatory if they felt like prison was not the right thing in an individual case. And then finally, about 3 or 4 years ago, around the same time that we dropped the rock here, the state legislature reduced, essentially took the last legal legs out from under the school zone laws. So it was a combination there. They didn't have ballot measures, but they had the organizing, they had civic engagement, and so forth. And they had an elite body and the state's highest court pushing to affect major drug reform. And that's got them at 37% decarceration since, again, their high water mark year was the year 2000, just before FAM entered the state and set up an office.
And just as a reminder for our online viewers, this is NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice program, and we are talking to Robin Steinberg, founder of the Bronx Defenders, and Judy Greene, a former Soros Senior Justice Fellow and criminal justice expert. They are two of the national criminal justice reform leaders who have contributed to the new book from the New Press called Decarcerating America, From Mass Punishment to Public Health. And I am Nicole Fortier, your moderator.
Can I just follow up on something?
You should go ahead.
I mean, I agree completely that, you know, whenever criminal justice reform, right, is taking place, it requires all different strategies, right? It is 100%, no one strategy is going to work. So it's going to involve litigation, it's going to involve organizing, it's going to involve legislation, it's going to involve policy reform, it's going to involve academia, it's going to involve elevating and honoring the voices and efforts of those who are most impacted by the system. It's going to involve the media. It's going to involve sort of communication strategies, sort of all of that stuff. I think is what leads to change, right? And what leads, you know, us to change the narrative, which is what has to happen to lead to change. It's like I sit and I listen to all the fantastic numbers and I, you know, about decarcerating here and decarcerating there. And I do, maybe it's the public defender in me, so I'm always the sort of skeptic in the room. And, you know, the thing I do want to just also remind people of is that while those things are happening, there are other things happening, right? So women are the fastest growing population in jails and prisons in this country, right? And rural areas are building more jails and jailing more people. And what looks like this incredible victory in New York City, you know, I look out and I see, yes, TNT no longer exists. And when I started as a public defender, TNT was very much a part of it. But I watch what goes on in the South Bronx with NYPD and its gang enforcement. And I'm appalled, and it looks to me like the exact same strategy, right? Which is you target a black or brown community, you demonize and criminalize people's race and poverty, you go into that housing development as if you are a military occupying force, and you paint everybody with a broad brush, right? And that's happening right now, right? And so I see that, and I always say to myself, you know, there's good news, but I also think systems recreate themselves in different and new ways, and they call themselves different things, and they look different a little bit, but at the core of it, right, there is still sort of the issues around structural racism and class that exist that really, until we unpack, we're going to watch these systems constantly, you know, retooling themselves. And I think you see it in bail reform. You see it in bail reform 100%, right? So we're going to, you know, talk about, well, I could talk about bail reform for about 3 weeks, but you're going to talk about sort of, oh, we've done this amazing thing, we've done away with cash bail in this jurisdiction, but what we have replaced it with, or what will come next, is really the question for me. And maybe it's because I've been in the system for as long, and, you know, not as long as you have, but for a really long time on the ground, and watched how you think you've, you know, sort of been victorious in this one area, and the next thing you know, everybody's wearing a GPS monitor and ankle bracelets, and there's a chip implanted in their neck, right, by an apparatus that is now designed to supervise and surveil the same communities that we used to incarcerate. And so it's really important I just wanted to throw it out there as we talk about, you may be sitting out there thinking, wow, 37% decline in this. There are things happening, and always the potential, right, for more onerous things to happen, right? And so I just needed to say that, even though, yes, I know that's what public defenders do.
And of course, and my next question was, New York can't be perfect. What should we as reformers be rallying around next? What is it that we still need to tackle here?
Well, there's a network of organizations in New York that's looking at the gang problem, and that is...
You mean the NYPD enforcement of
yes,
their
the gang enforcement problem, pardon me. And that's a particularly bitter pill, I think, for New York, because going all the way back to the 1950s, when gang violence, serious gang violence erupted, largely on the Lower East Side and in some areas in East Harlem, the city under Mayor Lindsay smartly listened to sociologists and academia here in the city, principally two at Columbia, Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin, who said, this is a youth problem more than it's a crime problem, pointing out that, most kids who are in gangs are just in gangs. They're not marauding and shooting people and so forth and so on. And so the city's strategy for dealing with the problem of kids in gangs and gang violence for decades was social interventions, street organizing. Mayor Lindsay opened up the civil service rules so that gang leaders could become city employees. And the social development or youth development strategy kept this city in the category of a place where there are gangs, but we're not a gang problem. We're not a gang city like Chicago or Los Angeles, both of whom are kind of the epitome of the crackdown on gangs with gang injunctions and gang lists and sentencing enhancements if they nab you as a gang member, no matter what you were nabbed doing or not. And so it breaks my heart to see the gang enforcement meme travel east and its impact on the gang problem in this city is not going to be good. But Babe Howell, who's a law professor at CUNY Law, has looked closely at the data that she was able to FOIA and pinpointed that Operation Crew Cut, which I think Cy Vance kicked off as kind of the first publicly celebrated gang enforcement strategy, came right on the heels of the enormous victory against stop and frisk. And so it's very much the notion of it's kind of a pneumatic, you push it down here, it pops up here, but it's a pneumatic dynamic that seems relentlessly pointed at young people of color in this city. And now a lot of it is being driven nationally as well as in New York City and certainly out on Long Island by the federal crackdown on immigration. So the Homeland Security Investigation Unit, which is part of ICE, is identifying places where they want to engage with local police and make a problem happen, which could remain at a low level, relatively insignificant aspect. I mean, the NYPD is now saying that so much of the violence in New York is gang motivated. But if you look at the statistics they report to the mayor's management report every year, it's still fewer than 500 cases identified as gang-related in terms of felony cases or index crimes. And that's out of what, 350,000 crime incidents reported in New York? But now we have a gang problem.
Right.
True. And Robin, you referenced bail, and so I know, of course, across the country, reformers are fighting a trendy fight, if anything, to reform our bail systems. I know that the Bronx Defenders has established the Bronx Freedom Fund. I was wondering if you could sort of explain what that is and how you're trying to replicate it in other places.
Sure. So in 2005, my co-founder of the Bronx Freedom Fund, David Feiga, who was then a colleague of mine, now my husband, and I started something called the Bronx Freedom Fund. And it really was born out of frustration at watching bail get set on clients and watching our clients hauled into jail cells and then the inevitable plea of guilty because everybody's going to plead guilty to go home. Anybody who has ever spent 5 minutes in Rikers Island or on the boat or in any other jail would plead guilty to go home. And so, at some point, David said, well, we should just start a bail fund and just bail people out. And of course, we got the inevitable, it's unethical, it's illegal, you can't do it, whatever. And it took us 2 years till we could find somebody actually brave enough to actually give us any money to start the fund. who turned out to be Jason and Joe Flom, actually, who were like, okay, sure, give it a try, but still was an incredibly brave thing to do. And so we opened the fund in 2007, and we began to bail people out. And to be perfectly, and of course, I had to create a separation between the Bronx Freedom Fund and the Bronx Defenders that I was running, so we created a separate 501c3 and housed it in the Bronx Defenders in a cubicle outside my office. But it had its own board and it had its own sort of entity, and the lawyers in the Bronx Defenders would refer clients that they thought would be eligible for the bail to the Bronx Freedom Fund, and the Bronx Freedom Fund would then do an interview and began to pay bails. And what we learned, and so we started in 2007, so it's been operational for 11 years now, and what we learned, quite frankly, exploded our beliefs about bail in lots of ways. And, you know, I didn't really know what we were going to find. You know, I was sort of like, I don't know, maybe people do come back to court because their cash is at stake. It makes sense, maybe it intuitively makes sense, right? Until we started using donated dollars to pay people's bail, and we began to learn that 96% of our clients came back to court, even though it wasn't their money and they had nothing at stake in terms of the money, which kind of exploded our ideas about money being an incentive to make people come back to court. But we learned a lot about how the system itself operates, right? So we began to learn, okay, so 90% of the clients that got held in on misdemeanors were in the Bronx were pleading guilty, and when we paid people's bail with philanthropic dollars, what wound up happening was almost half the cases got dismissed. The majority, the other half of the cases wound up in non-criminal dispositions, right? So violations, which have far fewer collateral consequences. They still have some, but they have far fewer. And, you know, and we began to see judges and prosecutors working out dispositions on cases that didn't involve jail at all. So we sort of have been running this for about 11 years, and then decided that we really had to think about a way is how do you take the revolving bail fund model, so, you know, bail comes back at the end of a case. If somebody comes back to court each and every time, the bail money comes back at the end of a case. So when you think about it, you can create this revolving thing that you never have to keep raising money for, which is kind of a cool model. And that was our big bet, right? And so that worked. And we decided at some point that we really needed to take this national, and so we got some funding to create now a national organization called the Bail Project, and it has sites, so the Bronx and Queens are a part of that, but we now have sites up and running in St. Louis and in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're about to go into our next 3 sites, which are Detroit, Dallas, and Louisville, Kentucky. And the goal is over the next 5 years, we'll have 40 sites across America that will replicate the revolving bail model that we created in the Bronx, with the goal of bailing out about 160,000 people in 5 years. That's the goal.
Amazing.
And it's been, you know, look, it's really interesting. It's everything we were talking about before. It's everything that you know about criminal justice, and it's important to recognize too. There is no national solution, right, to these problems, right? Criminal justice is so insanely local, right, that when I left New York to sort of do a lot of the work I've been doing, what I realized really quickly is nobody actually cares about the data in New York, which is fascinating and a little discouraging and disheartening.
No one
you know,
cares about New York.
I'm kind of like, I can't believe you don't care about this. But you know, people will look at me in another, you know, state that looks very, very different, and sort of say to me, yeah, so that's what the data was in the Bronx. No relevance to me. And I'm like, no, but it has some relevance. And I understand that perspective, right? We're about as foreign as, you know, to some places as, you know, Mars is to Earth. And so it's important that we recognize that when we're doing sort of any kind of bail reform, that it has to sort of recognize that it's going to be a local conversation. It has to involve sort of local solutions. And again, to keep your eyes on the prize, which is that even if you are able to get people out of jail and bail reform is successful, watch out about what comes next, right? So what we're really hoping, the core of sort of, obviously the Bail Project is to get as many people out as quickly as we can. Let me just say, that is my goal. That is, if that's the last thing I do, that's the last thing I do. But the second thing is, we're hoping to really, the bail fund model proves one thing. It proves that ROR, releasing somebody on their own recognizance, is the answer, right? Because you're just paying somebody's cash bail. You're not using ankle bracelets, you're not doing supervision, you're not doing surveillance, you're not setting up conditions, you're not making people pee in cups to see if they use drugs that week. And so what we're hoping to do is to sort of take this model that really is the equivalent of releasing somebody on recognizance and making the argument in different jurisdictions as they are moving towards more bail reform. You do not need to recreate onerous systems of supervision and surveillance of low-income communities and communities of color. You can just release people. The overwhelming majority of time, you can just release people, and they will come back to court. And that's really the secondary goal of the bail project.
Amazing. Well, I could ask questions for days, but I'm much more interested in hearing what our audience here is hoping to ask. Hold on. Henry in the back there is going to be walking around with a mic, so just start raising your hands. And one request, we're hoping to keep questions brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. No part 1, part 2 kind of things. And please keep it to an actual question. Go ahead, right there.
Thank you. Alex Vitale, Brooklyn College. Thanks for bringing up the gang policing issue, very close issue for me. Why do you think the mayor continues to support a policy that seems so obviously misguided and unjust?
Frankly, I think the mayor has been a disappointment to me on the criminal justice side in terms of, you know, his politics, his attitude about social justice in general. I mean, I was among those that were shocked when he brought Bill Bratton back. And I think that, you know, there's a dynamic that in many places other than New York between mayors and their police departments that sort of was mirrored with what happened here in New York when we had our first and only black mayor, who, you know, during the first really vivid front page, News at 5, News at 11, problem with violent conflict in Brooklyn, basically pitted the department against the mayor, and he became, you know, a one-term mayor. The police departments are enormously powerful, and it takes more than a mayor, you know, to rein them in. And then we could talk about district attorneys too.
And then we could talk about Department of Corrections, and we could talk about, right. I agree with that assessment completely. There are incredibly powerful unions at play. There are huge voting blocks. There's the conversation about who captures the narrative. And certainly in New York City around crime, NYPD captures the narrative and pushes the narrative, even if it is completely belied by the facts and statistics. The narrative continues to be pushed and pushed. There are enormous economic interests at stake. There are enormous, you know, interests of all sorts, I think, at stake here. And, you know, I agree with Judy.
So my question is, first of all, I'm fascinated with what you're talking about with kind of economics belies a lot of this. And I remember taking a class, I'm about the same generation as you, I started in this business in 1980, and remember taking a class in undergraduate called The Economics of Crime. And it was just fascinating, really opened my eyes to how much a driver money is in terms of government, and that's why I'm so hopeful with this generation that's coming up now. The students marched the other day because I don't think they're driven as much by money, and they're starting to take on the big I don't want to say policymakers, but the big interests. Exactly. So my question specifically is, and in thinking about your model, the bail model being circular, yes, it makes perfect sense. However, aren't there plenty of jurisdictions that also count on people not showing up so that they keep their bail money? And then on the back end, can we use this somehow, use a model like that for release, like probation, parole, things like that. Right now, I know we're starting, I'm in New Jersey, and we've just started to look at peer navigators, which is becoming pretty popular around the country. So we've just started that program in the state prison system, so I'll be very, using ex-offenders, so I'll be very interested to see how that works. That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to address in that. And, you know, so I want to be really clear sort of about the bail fund model, right? It's not an answer to the problem, right? It is designed for one thing and one thing only, right? Which is to get people out of jail cells while reform is moving forward. It's not a reform itself. It's just an immediate response. It's a direct action to basically say, while this is all going on, and thoughtful people and interesting people and people who really think about these issues are working towards those goals, it's not okay to leave people sitting in jail cells. And so it really is a direct action to that. That's really its purpose. I would be delighted to put ourselves out of business. Like, I would be delighted. Nothing would make me happier. You know, everybody on my team, we would do a joy dance. I don't think change happens that quickly, but to ask people to sit in jail cells while we work on systemic change is, you know, something I'm not willing to tolerate. So that's really sort of what that's designed to do. And so I don't want it to be mistaken for anything else as a sort of model. I think it's a stopgap measure to get people out and learn from it, right? And so, you know, actually we hire locally at jurisdictions to our staff who are called bail disruptors, right? So, and the bail disruptors are the people that are doing the interviews and paying the bails and following clients and supporting them through the process. And those are community activists, and most of them are formerly incarcerated people who are doing that work and sort of, you know, capturing those stories and that information. So I'm not sure I think about it as a long-term strategy or even a long-term solution to much of anything. But I do think that, you know, you're from New Jersey, so one of the things I know that those of us in the field worry about in New Jersey, right, is that the same kinds of technical violations, right, that drove people back into jails across America for probation violations or parole violations that were not usually reoffense, but were in fact technical violations. Our concern about what happens in a place like New Jersey is now you have people who have technical violations who wind up back in jail and there's no way out, right? Because now they're in there on preventative detention. And that's something I think that we need to really unpack and look at really carefully as reform moves on. I always like to say I wish New Jersey had a revolving bail fund for a whole long time before they moved to the model they did, because I do worry about what comes next there in the long term.
So I'm a layperson here, but I'm interested in any statistics or other information you can give us on violent versus non-violent offenders, let's say. And does it point to any different reforms for one versus the other?
Well, it's very broad, speaking in a very broad-brush way. Recidivism rates for people who are incarcerated on nonviolent crimes tend to be higher than recidivism rates for people who are incarcerated on violent crimes. And I think that's been true for years and continues to be true. It's complicated in terms of trying to unpack that, what it means. I mean, because there's a general tendency along people's lives, life course. Crime is a young person's game, for the most part. And so perhaps it has to do with the people who are convicted of violent crimes are typically held for very long periods of time, in this country at least, not so much elsewhere. And we need to know more about what those patterns look like in places like Scandinavia or the Netherlands, you know, where a really serious long prison term is 7 or 8 years, compared to you know, we're the world capital of life without parole, even for juveniles still in this state. So there's lots to unpack there, but by and large, that's the pattern. Of course, the reason that people get such long terms, particularly in this country, does not have much to do with their likely recidivism, as we know from the history of, you know, the sorry record of parole in New York State. But with people who go up for parole time after time and are told that they can't be paroled because of the nature of their crime. Carol Shapiro, who's here and is a relatively new appointee to the parole board, is beginning to hopefully make that corner turn. And you know, if New York had done what New Jersey did, which was basic parole reform, which was the biggest factor in their 37% decline, New York would be way ahead of New Jersey, way ahead of everyone else in the country. Parole is an enormously important factor, but it really doesn't have that much to do with danger. It has a lot more to do with our culture, with community attitudes, with retribution.
Yeah, I mean, in the bail context, it's a slightly different conversation, right? And I'm about to say the most conservative thing that I ever have said in my entire life, which is I actually believe fundamentally in the principle you're supposed to be presumed innocent, like when you're at the bail stage. And I know that sounds wildly naive, and I actually believe it. Blame it on NYU, I went to school here. You know, it appears that we don't really believe. Like, I think, you know, we have to grapple with whether we believe or we don't believe that, right? And if we believe it, then we need to live up to it, right? And if we don't. So I don't draw the distinction between what somebody's charged with, whether it's quote unquote violent or nonviolent. Sort of we look at the very front end at the bail reform, and you look at the front end of bail, and it should be set, you know, in an amount that is affordable. That was what bail was designed to do. So, you know, the big secret about bail is that it was actually designed to be a form of conditional release. It was actually created, right, to be set in an amount that somebody can pay, not can't pay. And over the years, it became this incredible tool for holding people in jail cells and, you know, forcing pleas, but that's actually not what it was designed to do. But I would just say in the conversations about violent versus nonviolent, again, it's about who's captured the narrative about who's really in our criminal system, right? And what really are we talking about, and what are the majority of people charged with, right? And as they're coming through the system, and the overwhelming majority are not charged with crimes that you would consider a risk for your public safety, right? But who captures the narrative and the way that gets discussed? I was saying to somebody, I was at a panel at UCLA, and I had a prosecutor standing next to me, and I was talking about bail, and of course he trotted out the worst possible case you can think of, like your worst nightmare. Like, go to sleep at night and think about your worst possible crime nightmare. And I thought to myself, if I had $1 for every prosecutor and every police officer and every politician that trotted out one of those stories as if it was at all, right, symbolic of most of the people that are in the system, I'd be a very, very, very wealthy woman. It is designed to scare you and to throw you off from looking at the real picture and what's really going on, right? And so I think all of us, particularly as lay people, right, particularly as people in the community, you need to be very, very, very vigilant about narratives and who's pushing them and why. And this became really, so I work in North Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is the predominantly black community, was the community that was burned to the ground in the 1921 race massacre in that town, where the white community came into the black community and burned it to the ground. It was the Wall Street of black America back then. And I was in Oklahoma for a couple of years, and I was watching the news constantly. I was thinking to myself, wow, I don't know why, but like, we're in North Tulsa, and I have a place in North Tulsa, and I don't see it. And the narrative was so prevalent that it was a scary, dangerous place. And then we actually did the data and the research. And of course, the murder rate was wildly higher, actually, on the south side of the railroad tracks, right, than it was on the north side. but the narrative drives so much of what we do in this country, and the exception, not the rule, right? So I'm always sort of saying, you know, as lay people and as voters and as people think about this, be really conscious and ask the hard questions like, what are the numbers? Is that the exception or is that the rule? Is that designed to scare me or is that real, right? Because you'll see a real difference in those things.
Numbers, because that's what I was looking for, those numbers.
Numbers about what in particular?
Of the 2.2 million people that we say are incarcerated, or incarcerated, what percentage of them committed violent crimes?
It's a little over a half.
That's not the case with the 11 million we're churning through the system, okay? So those are people that have already been sentenced to prison. The 11 million people we're churning through the system, the overwhelming majority of people are being churned through the system on cases that you would not consider a risk to your public safety.
And I think it's
Actually,
important.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was next.
So sorry, I was saying, I think it's also important to note that sometimes we have to contend with the question, are we sending people who have committed serious and violent crimes to jail for too long? And we have to be okay with that. So just looking at those numbers isn't the entire story. If somebody commits a crime, what's a genuinely fair and effective way to handle that is a question we all have to contend with. And Decarcerating America and these 50% goals that many organizations are shooting for now, you can't hit 50 until you also hit that question and decide how we as a society want to deal with that.
And unpack, right, the drug charges, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, if you look at women in Oklahoma, the overwhelming majority of women are going into the system for drugs, property crime, and criminal impersonation, right? So you have to really think about that, and do you consider that a problem we should solve through a public health lens, right? Or through a punitive criminal lens? And I think that's really where we have gone off the cliff still, and we continue to be off the cliff.
I think we only have time for one more question, so you have the honor of the last one.
All right. I have a quick question, but just an answer to your statistics number in New York. I have a quick question, but an answer to your statistics question about New York. There are about 500,000 arrests in New York a year. 40,000 of them are for alleged violent felonies. 8,500 of those end up with a conviction for a violent felony offense. Anyway, my quick question, I don't want to get into statistics too much, is you know that Governor Cuomo has proposed or advanced what he called a bail reform package this year. For the first time, he would change the law so that it's not dependent just on risk of flight or risk of return, but he would add in preventive detention, which means a prediction about public safety, whether the person may, at some unspecified time in the future, commit some unspecified new offense. And he would
You think
put
that's inexact?
He would put that in. He included that in his package. For, even though I think something like 40 states already do something like that. So if you have a comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, for me personally, for all of the flaws that we have in our criminal legal system here in New York State and all of the reasons I do the work I do, and whether it's stop and frisk or broken windows or all the sort of awful things we've done, the one thing I loved about New York was that our bail statute actually refused to have an idea about dangerousness being a factor to consider. And so I was obviously deeply disheartened when I saw that the proposed legislation was going to put into our bail legislation what had been rejected by the American Bar Association for decades, which was the idea that we can actually predict dangerousness. And anybody that's been in this work as long as we have, or anybody that comes from impacted communities, will tell you that dangerousness is fraught with all sorts of criminalization of race and poverty and history. And the minute you begin to sort of unpack that, you realize that dangerousness is something that I don't want to see in the New York statute. I fear that it's going to be there. There were a lot of people who wanted it to be put into the statute, and I'm sure Judy.
I'm going to put my Vera Institute hat back on, because the bail reform movement in the 1960s was spawned in New York City, at the Vera Institute, with the Manhattan Bail Project. And the Manhattan Bail Project grew over the years into a large agency called the Criminal Justice Agency, New York Criminal Justice Agency, which is basically the bail function. They interview almost everybody coming through, and they use a predictive model that's purely based on community ties and predictive of risk of flight. There's probably some way in which those the numbers produced are probably skewed somewhat in terms of racial impact. More low-income people have more trouble, keeping their community ties, or homeless people and whatnot. But nothing like the kind of algorithm that's driving these predictive models for danger. And I'm heartbroken also because New York State has long had the strictest law on preventive detention, which is clear and present danger, and that's what's being wiped out. And New York City, with the Manhattan Project as an adult, continues among big cities to have the highest rate of release on recognizance, the lowest rate of failure to return, and as well as criminal misbehavior while people are out on bond. Why we need to reform the bail laws in New York City, at least, is a great mystery to me. Somebody should ask the mayor and the governor.
Well, our thanks for your questions, and our sincere thanks to both Robin and Judy for being here today. Again, they have both contributed to Decarcerating America, From Mass Punishment to Public Health, which will be ready for purchase in the corner, and there will be a book signing right after this. I am Nicole Fortier from the ACLU, and on behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice, please keep up with their good work online at brennancenter.org. Follow them on Facebook and Twitter. Watch their videos on YouTube. I suspect this is where we will end up. And listen to our podcast on iTunes. Thank you again, especially to our audience, for being here at NYU Law School.